Welcome to Lead Pods, the official leadership podcast from USMB for pastors and church leaders, where our goal is to increase our impact together.
Hello friends, welcome to episode 93 of the USMB Lead Pods, the final episode of 2023. My name is Matt Erzman and really grateful to be your host once again. Today we have a little bit of a different episode because we're actually taking the audio from a recent webinar that USMB hosted. Some of you perhaps even attended the Zoom webinar that we held just a couple weeks ago, that was called Shifting Sands, Developing Young Leaders in a Changing Landscape. So recently, if you get the USMB emails or if you read the Christian Leader, you've probably realized that there's been a kind of a focus on the next generation of leadership, and we're finding there's a little bit of a gap where we don't have as many emerging younger pastors, younger leaders in our USMB family, or really in the U.S. church in a whole. And we obviously want to address that problem and figure out what caused it, what trends are there that's leading to this, and what can we do as church leaders to address that. So I had the honor, the privilege of hosting that webinar. We were joined by three really great guests. We talked with Kyle Goings, Joanna Chapa, and Wendell Loewen. They'll have different areas of expertise, different experience that I think is really helpful for us to start wrapping our mind around this problem. And as you'll hear here in just a minute, it's a pretty big thing that isn't going to be solved overnight, but we want to start chipping away at it. And I think we made some good progress on this webinar. I learned a lot from these three, and I think you'll enjoy hearing from them as well. And so they'll introduce themselves here in just a minute. But let's get to our conversation about what our church families can do to develop more young leaders in the church.
Christmas is just around the corner, but there's still time to delight someone with a unique gift. And sometimes the best gifts are ones that can't be pulled off a shelf. Gather your family and friends and browse MCC's Giving Guide, full of gifts like clean water and school meals for people across the globe. You can even give someone in need an eco-friendly stove or a bicycle. MCC's relief, development, and peace work brings hope to people in the name of Christ. Visit mcc.org/delight to give Christmas gifts that change lives.
All right. Well, hello, everybody. It's good to see your faces. One thing that Don mentioned that the webinar is going to be recorded, but along with that, this will also be one of our very few live episodes of Lead Pods, the Denomination Leadership Podcast. So some of you listening at the moment might actually be listening later on the podcast release. So grateful to have you with us, whether you're listening or if you're with us on the video call today. Grateful to have you here. So as you've been hearing lately in USMB land, we've been talking a lot about this kind of upcoming leadership gap in the upcoming generations. Janae wrote a great article for Christian Leader. Some of you maybe have seen some of the emails that have come out where there's just fewer and fewer upcoming students, the new generation, who at least seem to have an interest in a career in ministry. And we're seeing that, we're flagging that, and we want to do our best to get out in front of it and see what we can do to help maybe reverse that trend in our churches. So as Don mentioned, we have three presenters today. I'll have them very briefly introduce themselves. Our time is going to go really, really quickly here. But Kyle, let's start with you. Kyle, can you give us a very quick bio, who you are, and your role with USMB?
Yeah, so I am part of USMB Next Gen, which is all things next generation youth ministry, young adults on a national level for the USMB conference. I do my own podcast, Embrace the Awkward podcast, all about youth ministry. But my full-time job is actually the Next Gen pastor at Ridgepoint Church in Wichita, Kansas. I got a lovely wife and two girls.
Awesome. Thanks, Kyle. All right, next up, we'll hear from Wendell from Tabor. So Wendell, where are you at? I don't see you on my screen right now. There you are. Wendell, can you introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, my name is Wendell Loewen. It's a privilege to be on the podcast. I teach here at Tabor. I've been in the Bible and Ministry department for a number of years. I also direct a youth leadership program called Faith Front, which is the second iteration of, I guess, was Ministry Quest, funded by the Lilly Endowment. And I also serve part-time as a special assistant to the president for constituent engagement. So,
awesome. Very good. Grateful to have you here, Wendell. And finally, our third presenter today is Joanna Chapa. Joanna, can you do a quick bio as well?
Yeah, buenos dias, everybody. It's a sweet gift to be together in this way. And as Matt said, my name is Joanna Chapa. I serve with Multiply as a regional mobilizer. And I've been with Multiply for about 11 years now. A few years before this role, I was serving in Peru. And before that, I was serving as a short-term mission mobilizer, predominantly working with young adults, high school, college age, and then got to work with young adults in Peru for a few years. So it's been a learning curve of coming back to North America and learning this cultural reality that we find ourselves in with some of the generational conversations that we'll be having today. So I'm excited that we're at the table together, and consider it a gift and a privilege to be able to be with you all this morning.
Thanks, Joanna. Grateful to have you here as well. So before we get too far, I think it's helpful for us just to talk about some of the background, some of the stats and the numbers that we have been looking at as some of the USMB leaders, so that we're all on the same page. And what's interesting is if any of you follow Barna or Carey Nieuwhof or any of those kind of Christian research gurus, a lot of them are saying some of the same things, not only in the NB denomination, but nationwide. And it's also true in other fields like education and police officers. You're probably seeing this in other fields as well, where there just seems to be this shortage of young people rising up in leadership. So, Kyle, I know this is something that's really near and dear to your heart. You've done a ton of research on this. Why don't you get us started with some of the stats, the background that you're familiar with?
Yeah. So I've been involved in youth ministry and young adult ministry for 20 years now, a big chunk of it in the Mennonite Brethren denomination. So how I picture this to kind of get things started is, if, let's say we're all lost, but we have a map in front of us, okay? If we have a map in front of us, what you need is actually 2 points on the map to get you unlost, if you will. So first you need your destination, where you want to go, okay? That's difficult, but what's more difficult is actually to find out where you are, your current location. You need those 2 points in order to figure out where you're going to go. So right now, I think before we can get going to the issues and the reasons why we have this issue, we need to kind of actually name what is the problem. So before we get to how we got here, where are we now, right now? So I want to be honest and direct. I love our church. I love our denomination, but I do think we need to be honest with where we are. So here's the whole thing wrapped up. What we're seeing on a national level, multiple denominations, local church, districts, all that, is what I call a generational succession crisis. Okay. We have right now, we're experiencing it. We're not going to, we are experiencing a generational succession crisis. So when I say generational, what do I mean? Basically, you can separate the 2 big chunks of generations. There's multiple generations, boomers, baby builders, all that, into people over 40 and people under 40. Okay. That's where the generational gap starts. And we're noticing that partly due to technology, how technology has interacted between these 2 generations. So Gen Z, which is age 10 through 27, that's those people who are considering going into ministry, including in the workforce, young people either just going into college, teenagers, or just coming out of college. Millennials, which the church has focused on for many years now, is age 28 through 41. So under 40 is the 2 generations, Gen Z and millennials, okay? So how this all started for me is this summer, the Christian Leader started doing an article, and it started off with kind of giving an update on our national leadership pipeline, which is our national internship program that we offer. And this is our 2nd year doing it. So Janae wanted to kind of share, okay, how did it go? And so we were pretty honest, and we knew we were going to struggle with finding candidates to place into churches, but we didn't know we were going to be struggling this much the 2nd year. And so that kind of opened up a can of worms, if you will. And that article, then Janae went around and kind of asked a bunch of people in that article, but it's pretty fascinating how across education institutes, MB Foundation, districts, local churches, national programs, we're just seeing this lack of leadership development, but also just lack of young people even considering going into ministry. Even it's not even pastorhood, just ministry in general. So enrollment for ministry degrees, multiply, seminaries, grant programs, internships, they're down. And I thought it's not just the MB kind of denominational problem, and it isn't. It's across most denominations. There's not really one denomination that's saying, we got this handled and it's taken care of. So I'll wrap up and summarize in 3 big issues on kind of where we are. So these aren't really reasons. These are just kind of issues on this generational succession crisis. Issue number 1, according to Barna, in 2024, the average age of a lead pastor in the United States will be 60 years old. It will be the oldest since they started tracking it or keeping track of it. This is across all denominations. And there's lots of reasons for that. Some, like, people are delaying retirement due to the economic crisis in 2008 and the pandemic in 2020. We have a longer life expectancy in the U.S. Many use ministry as a second career. So they might be in the secular world for 10 plus years and then feel called to ministry. And so they just want to continue on with that. Basically, what this means is within the next 5 to 10 years, we'll have a majority of pastors in the retirement age, but there's really not a clear succession plan. Most churches just don't have on who's next. And so the numbers are kind of dwindling. And that leads me to number 2. Also, Barna also states, and this is an article, it's an older article, clear back in 2017, but it states that there are now more pastors over the age of 65 than there are under the age of 40. And so in 1992, when they did this study, there was 6% of pastors were over the age of 65. Now, 17%. That's almost triple the amount of pastors over 65. In 1992, there's 33% of pastors under the age of 40. Now, less than half, 15%, are under the age of 40, which means in reality, there's just not enough young leaders to replace the current ones, even if we wanted to. There just is a generational gap, and we'll get into the reasons why in just a little bit. And it's actually getting wider in the church. Businesses, secular businesses are noticing this too, but I feel the church is kind of feeling the effects of it a little bit more. And it kind of started with the millennial generation. They just didn't understand, connect, whatever. They were so drastically different than Gen Xers and so forth. And so Gen Z has kind of been forgotten because all this research came out of millennials. And so now there's not really a strategy, there's not really interest, all that kind of stuff. And the gap is getting wider and wider for this. So some of the issues, number 3 with this, most churches, and this is just my experience, I'm not saying all churches, maybe your church is doing great and awesome, but working on a national level since 2009 on that, talking to churches with the MB denomination, without the MB denomination, with youth pastors, most churches and denominations are unaware, unconcerned, or unable to do much about this generational succession crisis. That's just the reality. And everyone has ideas, but no one really has a clear plan on, okay, here's what we're going to do, because it's such a complicated issue. It's not just a simple, like, oh, we just need to find more young people. And this isn't new. Okay, I want to be clear. I might be new on the scene right now, but our denomination has been talking about leadership development for at least the 20 years I've been part of the denomination. There's been countless meetings of districts and pastors and organizations to say, okay, what are we going to do? How are we going to develop leadership development in like young leaders? So this has been going on for 20, 30 years. Our goal here is not necessarily to fix it in one webinar and everything's okay. But I do think it's different than it was 20 years ago, because at least 20 years ago, there was a little bit of a trickle. It's almost nil in what we're seeing with the younger generations. If you look at the millions of people versus the students or young people in the church. The other thing is this was 30 years in the making. I think part of this is started in the 90s when churches moved to what I call a seeker-friendly model. They started really focusing on evangelism and add modern worship and do fun events. Now, I love modern worship, love the haze, all that. So I'm not against any of that. But what I don't think most churches realize is when they went to that model, discipleship or leadership development was kind of a sidelined or even sacrificed for the sake of evangelism. And so we just didn't have leadership development as part of our church culture as once we did before the 90s in that. So with the church's less focus on next generations, people under 40, the younger generations are more religiously unaffiliated. Statistics show the younger you get, more likely less religiously affiliated you are. They're either done with the church, they grew up with the church and they're no longer part of it, or they never started in the first place compared to the older generations. This means that there are simply fewer Christians the church could even draw from for people who consider going into being a ministry leader or a pastor or a missionary or anything like that. So we're kind of really far behind in reality on this. Now, my goal here is not to scare you, all right? But with this webinar, our aim is to initiate a conversation centered around the rapidly changing culture and landscape that we are currently experiencing. As a denomination, or maybe as a local church or whatever, our goal is to transition from what I would say a reactive stance, like, okay, what are we going to do? We hear this, now what? Versus a proactive one. It's easier said than done, I get it. While we acknowledge that a single webinar won't provide the solutions, it marks the beginning of our journey. And that's what we want this to be. We need encouragement. We need engagement. We need a collective effort from everyone to be part of this initiative, if you will, if it's going to be successful. So that's kind of why we are here today. So that's the problem. And we'll go on to the reasons a little bit later on.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Kyle. So for those of you watching and listening, just so you have an idea of where we're headed, next we'll hear from Wendell, and he's obviously very entrenched in this day to day. So he's going to provide us with some of the trends and some of the current realities he's seeing as he works with young people. And then Joanna will wrap us up with some ideas for solutions that we can all be working on. Wendell, let's transition to you now. Again, like this is day in and day out, you're seeing this kind of play out in real time. So what other current trends or realities are you seeing that we should be aware of?
Well, thanks, Matt. And thanks, Kyle, for teeing this up. It was really helpful. Yeah, this has been on my radar for a number of years, especially in my work. We've seen declining enrollment among ministry or Bible majors. And you may have seen or read about some of that in Janae's article some time ago. But, so the first thing is, okay, what's the issue? What's the cause? And the more I think about it, the more challenging it is to try to pin it down. It's a multi-layered, complex phenomenon that's been, as Kyle mentioned, it's been growing and emerging for decades, and it's just been a real challenge. There isn't just one thing to point to, and we say, that's the problem. So now we know what the problem is. Now we know how to fix it. And there's so many factors that contribute to this. And so I'm just going to share some that have risen to the surface for me as I keep thinking about this, what keeps coming to my mind. And there may be other observations that people have that would be just as valid, but these are the ones that come to my mind. And of course, if we want to unpack these and, interpret these observations, that would require some, further conversation. But here are a few things that I think about, how did we get to where we are? First, I point to some cultural trends. There's just a general disregard or disdain for the church. We're in a postmodern, post-Christian, some say post-truth world, and Christianity is less desirable. And we're losing our place at the cultural table. I like to think about like a Thanksgiving table. There's the big table and the kids' table, and for a long time, the church would carve the Christmas turkey, or whatever. But now I think our culture is sort of pushing Christianity to the margins. And some would say Christianity is under siege. And as a result, church leaders are generally suspect. Church leadership is not really admired. And we've seen the downfall of high-profile celebrity pastors recently. So pastoral ministry is not really an honored profession, or generally seen that way anymore. Something else that I've noticed in terms of, I'll lump it in cultural trends, is that ministry isn't really presented as a career option for high school students. Of course, we know that STEM careers are favored and preferred and promoted these days. And so when high schoolers take inventories at school about what careers they're interested in, there is no mention of ministry. In fact, I took one earlier this morning and couldn't find anything about a ministry opportunity or career. So there are very few, if any, opportunities for talented students to consider a career in vocational ministry. There are internships and conferences for all sorts of other careers, business or STEM careers, but there's really nothing for ministry. And I think that's where Faith Front in earlier Ministry Quest came in. We're trying to help students think about ministry at a younger age. And I think parents are trying to steer their children toward higher paying careers, discouraging ministry as a viable career option. We can talk about a toxic work culture and low pay as another reason why I think students are being steered away from it. So it's just not really a viable, it's not even on the radar as a career option for our younger generation. So those are a couple of cultural trends. I think there's some church trends that I see in a lot of ways, mirroring culture with a high emphasis on individualism. Some would say radical individualism, and that sort of shapes our understanding of faith in the church. And as far as this topic is concerned, the church is less of a body and more a collection of individuals, or generally seen that way. And so with an individualized culture, we see calling as the work of the individual. And so the church sort of takes a hands-off approach. I'll leave it up to the student or the young person to figure out who they are, let them talk to God. And we're not really collectively speaking into their lives and telling them what we see and how God could be working in their lives. And so the church itself doesn't see itself as a community that call. We've sort of abandoned that role. I would also think that there's a bit of a misunderstanding of what pastoral leadership is, maybe, what they would be called to. Often pastors are seen as content creators that are competing for followers, or I know in a conversation earlier, Kyle talked about sort of this idea of being an entrepreneurial pastor that has some sort of following on social media or something. But the church needs shepherding pastors. And so we're not even clear of what we would call young people to, I think. Another church trend would be just, looking a lot like the culture in terms of fragmentation and polarization. Just students see that in the church, and they want to avoid being a leader in this kind of cultural environment. And so parents sort of advise against that. And there's one other piece that's been part of my study for years is psychosocial and developmental realities, that the journey toward adulthood has extended into the 30s. So the questions that young people are asking about identity, belonging, and autonomy, who am I? Where do I fit? Do I and my choices matter? They're processing these questions, and they're right at the forefront of what they're trying to figure out in life, and they don't even know when they have the answers. And there's been a bit of an abandonment in terms of the adult world helping them answer those questions. So the adult world just isn't really interested, or maybe we're too busy or involved to nurture them. If you think of it as a tightrope, and they're walking across this tightrope toward adulthood and answering those questions, we're not encouraging them along the way. And so students are left to themselves in terms of self-understanding and navigating life, or developing a sense of calling. So these are just some of the factors that I think of, and I know there are many others that we could talk about. And like Kyle mentioned, there are no quick fixes. It's going to take some time to make progress and some curiosity and patience if we want to address it as a denomination.
Thanks, Wendell. That's really helpful. So we keep saying there are no quick fixes, no easy answers, but now our friend Joanna is going to try to help us out here, because even though it's not a quick, easy answer, there are things that we can start doing, start thinking about, start talking about. And so we, of course, want to start on that trajectory, right? So Joanna, I know you have some ideas that you've thought about of things that churches might be able to start doing now. What are some of your suggestions for where to head with this reality?
One of the first things that comes to mind is we have to humbly approach this. As it is multi-layered, I think of one of the things when we're stepping in cross-cultural trips or mission trips or cross-cultural relationships or partnerships, we tend to, in the missiological sense, be able to see that culture is multi-layered. So we see the outside of what is, of what we notice, of what we see is made or done, with the lack of sometimes awareness that there is a deeper value that is pushing or moving what is the reality. So a bit of what I appreciate with Kyle and Wendell is that approach of like, there are reasons, there are values within the core of a culture and here of generations of why you do, why I do what we do. There is something beyond or deeper, more significant at our core of what we value, what is real. The cultural onion is something that, for anyone who wants to look that up on Google, there's the cultural onion reality that when you cross into cultures, you want to be aware that we are quick to judge, we are quick to see and just say, well, they should just do this. Why don't they just do this? I have the solution. They should just do it as I see it. And the reality of being learners and posture ourselves with that humble reality that there is deeper values that are forcing or pushing these things of what happens. And what we are today, where we're at as a church, is the fruit or product of many of those realities. So those layers, which means there's many solutions. There's not just a 1, 2, 3. And we realize that, especially as we were preparing for this webinar, we want to be aware that, yes, we see and we want to do something about it, but let's humbly say as well that this is not a one webinar or a one vision summit or a one reality thing. It's a continual relational approach to the table with each other in this. And yet at the same time, we want to ask, like, how do we move forward? How do we keep pressing in? So here are some of my observations and some of the things that I've heard through conversations with people like Wendell and Kyle and others. And even for myself, as someone who did go through the ministry class program as a high school student, there are things that I've observed, and I want to humbly approach the table with you all in this. When I would hear the phrase, "You are the church of tomorrow." I mean, how many of us have said that? You are the church of tomorrow. It with a hopeful, like, we're empowering them to be the church of tomorrow. Without seeing on the flip side, we're also telling the younger generations, you're not a part of the church today. That may seem like, oh no, that's not what we're trying to say. Yet at the same time, I remember hearing within some of my peers throughout high school and college, well, then I guess I'm not a part of the church today. So it kind of pushed the compartmentalization of church of like the ones who are the church today and the ones who are the church tomorrow. And then we lost the bridging of the gap of the church today, which is not this compartmentalization. We are the church together in that. And so unintentionally and maybe even unaware, that is something that I feel causes the great divide. So one suggestion that I come with for myself is stop saying it, stop living it, stop feeding into this, like, we are the church and you guys are the church of tomorrow, which leads into a few other things that I'll share in a bit. But before I go there, another observation I've had as I was reporting back to churches in 2019 after my first term in Peru, I had a sweet middle-aged woman come up to me at one of our churches and tell me, I'm just so thankful you're in Peru serving the Lord and walking with the people there in Peru. But I would never want my child or my children to go and do that. It is dangerous. They have to raise so much money. They're away from family. I wouldn't have them home for Christmas. And she went on and on. And I just sat there and was thinking, wow, do we have an idolatry of comfort and safety in North America? This sense of it is unsafe, and we aim for safety and we aim for comfort. And it's part of our culture that we haven't realized has really filtered through in our churches, and how we encourage, or their lack of encourage, our young people to be aware or open that this is an option, because our aim is not to be safe. Our aim is not to be comfortable when we follow Jesus. And so that was an insight for me of just like how often I actually have heard that I could never do what you do because of, And it usually leads to reasons of the idolatry of comfort and the idolatry of safety. So just an awareness to that, of how we then approach the generations within our churches. One suggestion that I would have as someone who had this from a few leaders and mentors, and some of you in this call, I had people who invited me out for help me understand. Yes, schedules are full, life is full. There's so much that we do. But what are the things that we're already doing? We eat. So just inviting a young person or someone from another generation within our churches to, let's sit down, help me understand why this is important to you or this is not important to you, because I want to be able to share with you just this insight, leaning into each other at the table versus I don't understand you, so I'm just going to retreat. Again, that leads into the safety and comfort piece, where it's uncomfortable to step into the things we don't understand. So we actually just retreat and let somebody else take care of it. When this is something that is not just up to the current pastors or conference leaders, this is a body of people, body of believers stepping into relational. And a suggestion also is the integration of intergenerational exchange within our churches. We've had, again, a lot of polarization within our churches we need spaces for the generations to learn within their peer groups, whether it's children, young people, adults, young adults. Yet at the same time, we've many times stayed there without learning how to cross-pollinate, if you will, to be able to mutually share in the koinonia, the partnership between the generations within our churches. Yeah, we've heard it already today, but just this lost reality of discipleship and walking with each other, because we're so busy doing a lot of other good things. We've lost this life on life walking with people, this discipleship, this mentorship. And many times when I hear mentorship, I hear people like, well, I don't have all the answers. I don't know how to approach it. Again, it's not about your comfortableness of it. Step into the relational, how can I speak into a person that is within our church, within the youth group that I can walk with and encourage and keep it simple. Many times we do, and we aim for structures, we aim for programs, which are helpful, but they are not. We shouldn't outsource discipleship. We shouldn't outsource leadership development to an institution or a program, but we should be walking in that culture of what Bruce Enns wrote recently, the article, The Lost Art of Shoulder Tapping. This is something that's been quite significant for me for probably the last 20 years, is how many times did I have someone tap my shoulder and say, have you thought of, or I've noticed that you have a passion or gift in blank. And many times when I had someone tell me that, it was usually a time of, I never even thought of that. And so this article is sharing a moment with actually a young man from Weatherford, Oklahoma, who had someone tap his shoulder, had a few people tap his shoulder, but again, simple. This reality of Holy Spirit, who are the people in front of me? Who is within our church today that I can tap the shoulder of? Because if we share our stories, I'm pretty sure most of us here will have at least one name and probably one page of names of people who tapped your shoulder. And that's why we're here, because we care. So there's this sense of people tapped our shoulders. And just like Jesus and Paul, just like Barnabas with Paul, he had to go tap the shoulder, and in a sense with Paul, and Paul with Timothy and Priscilla and Aquila, and so many people that we see throughout the New Testament church, this reality of who is around me? How can I notice? How can I look? How can I notice? And how can I invite? There's so much significance in a simple invitation of, have you ever thought of, or I notice that there is this passion that you have. A bit of the phrase that Jesus gives Peter and Andrew of "Come, follow me, and I will make you fishers of people." This invitation to a relationship, this invitation to a transformation in that relationship that he leads us in, and that it's unto the task ahead. So being able to walk with people from another generation is one of the things that I feel is not rocket science. It doesn't need a program. It's just a posture of an awareness, of looking, of having our eyes open, looking who is within our church today, and how can I encourage, how can I shoulder tap? Because there is so much power behind a simple awareness of what God can do, what he is doing as well in young people. So I know those are maybe for some a bit simplified, but I feel like that's maybe a place where we also need to remember to be in, is how can we follow, like what is tangible, all parts of the body can walk with. And I think most everyone in the body can do this. Again, this is not up to our conference leaders. It's not up to a certain group of people. This is something that the Holy Spirit, I think, will or has given each one of us to be able to see, to notice, and to call up and call out, to shoulder tap those that are a part of us today.
Thanks, Joanna. There's a lot of really good stuff there. And we've got a few questions we'll get to as we're starting to begin to wrap up here. I did want to make sure that I mentioned and that you all knew that, like we've said several times here, this is just step one or maybe step half of addressing this issue. There's still a long ways to go. One thing that our USMB leaders are doing early next year, they're gathering for a vision summit where this is the theme, the main thing that they're going to be discussing. And so some of you probably heard about that. Some of you might be attending. But if any of you have questions or issues that you want to make sure that team addresses as they gather, you're invited to submit those to Janae so you can get those to her, and she'll make sure those go to the right places, because we want to have your input as we continue to talk about this as a larger denomination. So before we kind of move on here, we do have several great questions. Thanks to those of you who have submitted those. Let's just start at the beginning here with the first one that we got from Clayton. And he wrote in and said, I've heard a few things discussed about parent influences, and I'm wondering if and how we as church leaders not only be engaging with Gen Z or Gen Alpha, but how might parents be engaged and discipled? So far, I've heard, I think all three of you spoke about just how important our words are, right? We need to choose our words carefully, make sure how we speak to them about these issues is really important. But any three of you, Kyle, Wendell, Joanna, do you have anything else for parents to consider as related to this topic?
Yeah, Joanna's advice is really good advice. Your words matter. How you view or perceive them matters on this. So here's what I would tell most parents, and this might not necessarily be a direct answer to your question, but if we're ever going to expect teenagers, particularly teenagers, to come into our world, in the adult world, we have to first go into their worlds. That's how we're going to build trust. That is as simple as possible. So here's what I would tell my parents. If I was training parents of my teenagers or the teenagers in my youth ministry or whatever, I would say, first off, you need to be a student of their culture. It wasn't like in years past where you can just let them grow up like normal. You need to know what apps they're using, what's culturally trends. YouTube Trends has a great YouTube channel that hears about the trends. Access.org, they have a cultural translator for Christian parents. The other thing is, I would say, do two things. Serve as a family, not just have them serve and you in their area and you serve in your area. As a parent, you should be serving together, and not just door greeters. I'm talking about actual serving where you're leading somewhere, where you're in the tech booth, where you're on stage worshiping, whatever it is. Serve with your teenager in that. And the other thing is, go on a mission trip with your teenager. That is probably one of the best experiences that you cannot get in a local church. You cannot get from a sermon. You cannot get anything in your church setting. When you go on a mission trip and you're serving alongside your student, and I'm not saying as a family, I'm saying maybe one parent and one student where there's that unique opportunity, man, you're going to see them in a whole new light. You're going to see them use gifts. Your teenagers use gifts more than ever before. And it's a way for them to see you and see you lead and all that. And you can say maybe after this trip, hey, what are you thinking? And if they feel and share, well, I might be wanting to do this full time, that's a perfect opportunity to shoulder tap, as Wendell would say, and kind of jump into that. So that's kind of how I would answer for that. It's just being a student of culture and then serve alongside each other.
Very good.
Yeah, I think understanding is kind of what Kyle was saying, trying to help parents understand where their teens are and kind of the stresses that they're dealing with. I've talked about psychosocial abandonment for a number of years with parents, and I get a lot of resistance because it's actually pointing the fingers at the adult generation, to point the finger at our young people or the current generation is kind of their problem. I think it started before them, and we need to ask ourselves, so what are we really afraid of? I think Joanna's comments about comfort are really appropriate, but to what point do we allow God to speak into the lives of our children and give them to God? And that's a hard thing for parents who love their kids.
All right, we had several more questions. We're not going to get to all of them, I'm afraid, but if I could kind of summarize, Darren had two really good questions. I'll kind of group together and you guys can respond. But he asked if the percentages of the trends are similar across different cultures, across different backgrounds, or is this mostly a Euro-American issue? Are we seeing similar things like different ethnicities, different races? And then alongside that, is part of this issue that more young people are drawn to parachurch organizations, other ministry opportunities? Kyle mentioned camp opportunities. Is it part of it that our young Christian leaders are just being drawn away to other ministries? Is that part of the issue? So,
Yeah, I'll address the first question there. And I can't remember what study it was that I read recently, but there is this reality that Gen Z is there's more cultural understanding within Gen Z across the globe. They're connected in a lot of ways through social media, through what they see on the web, on internet. And there's this reality of a Gen Z in North America can understand someone in Asia in a sense of the cultural reality. So it's not just a Euro-American church reality. I think this is something that is across the board. It's something we, at least from what I'm noticing and seeing within the Hispanic churches and many other churches within, and especially for us within the USMB family, to be more specific, I think we're seeing it across the board.
Yeah, it's hard for me to be able to speak to, other cultures. I do think in terms of competing ministries, I don't know if I want to term it that way, but young people who are interested in ministry tend to steer clear from pastoral ministry or church leadership because of, things that they've experienced growing up, church splits, church fights, whatever. So they are much more open to, camping or other nonprofit ministry opportunities that sort of fulfill this sense of need to help and restore, but they can steer clear of the arrows that congregations tend to shoot at them.
Yeah, I would just jump on that, Wendell, with it. Even secular companies are now talking about the impact they want to make on the world. You buy a shoe, we'll give a shoe to a person in need and all that. And so they're seeing, I can make an impact on this world. That's what I really want, even in the secular worlds. There's nothing necessarily wrong with that, but the church is still using the same old mantra of saying, hey, yeah, you can do that. But you also, camps are important too. And so all good things are being promoted and asked about these teenagers. And then you have colleges on top of that of saying, hey, be part of this and do this. So it is a lot of competition, and it kind of gets white noise after a while.
Okay, we're almost out of time. I'm going to try to squeeze in one more question. I think Mark had a really great question that some of you commented on in the chat here. But he brought up a really good point that the older average age of pastors goes along with the trend that most of our church congregation members are also older. A lot of our church congregations are older, therefore our pastors are older. So does that lead us to an awkward situation where we're potentially asking younger people to lead an older church that already has their own traditions, their own preferences? How do we do that? And how maybe is the first step that we need to get more younger people in our congregations first? Is that the first thing that we need to do before we expect them to start leading? I think that's a really good point that we should consider. Three of you, do you want to have any input on that?
Well, something that I was just jotting down here is the webinar was going on here. I think of an image of a river. We can offer denominational programs, internships, even church programming or internships. But I think the issue, we have to keep going upstream to really start to address what's really going on, educating our congregations about what it means to corporately call or be involved in the calling of our next generation. I think that's a step upstream. I think a step even further upstream would be having our churches be able to adopt this value of a culture of calling. And even further upstream, what does it mean for us as our churches to identify ourselves as a contrast community, that we're a community that's not like the world, and we want to gather around our students and call them to what God is calling them to. So yeah, you can talk about the onion if you want, but I think of this river and moving upstream and trying to address it, at a deeper level, and that's a hard thing. I think it'll take time.
Yeah, kind of jump on that. I would say first, in order for the church to survive, we need all generations to be a part of it. The younger generation is not more important than the older generation or the current generation in that. It's more of our perception. I think the older generation, the first thing that the perception has to change is, instead of viewing the younger generation as replacements, view them as reinforcements. Where there's an overlap, if you're in the battle and there's an overlap of both veterans and rookies, where there's some training, there's some mentorship, there's some influence that happens, and it's not just the veterans leave and then the rookies take over and they're not necessarily what to do. So yeah, having young people in the church, no church is going to say, yeah, we don't want any young people. Every church is going to want that. We don't necessarily have time to dive into this, but I would share one resource, the book Growing Young. It was by Kara Powell, but this is a book I would recommend to most churches who are saying, how do I reach the young people? How do I do that? And they have 6 essential strategies to help them discover young people and their love for church and your church. But one thing that they do say in the book that was pretty shocking to me is they said, look, due to all this research, and they did study and research young people and churches and all that. And what they've noticed is that if you're going to reach the young people, you have to disproportionately invest in that generation more than all the other generations. And that means time, that means money, that means personnel, that means everything if you're going to reach them. I'm not saying that's good. I'm just saying that's reality. And so that is sometimes harder because it requires more sacrifice on other areas of the church. But they do notice is if you have a young group coming into your church, it actually elevates almost every other area of the church as well. Excitement, passion, leadership, serving, giving even. A lot of people think young people don't give. They do, but they give to the causes they think is worthwhile. And so I would say that book is probably the next step.
And again, I apologize. A lot of you had really great questions. We're just going to not have time for today, but we can try to pass those on to the team that'll be addressing this at the Vision Summit. So one of our goals was to kind of wrap up our time today with a time of prayer. So I think I'm going to pass on to Joanna for some prayer, and then we'll wrap up with some closing thoughts after that. So Joanna, would you mind leading us in prayer?
Invite us to take some time to just sit in silence and let him maybe say something. Father, you have knowledge of all things. You see all things, and we humbly come to you this morning as the USMB family. And we want to come to the table together in recognizing and remembering and bringing an awareness that you are our head, Jesus. So lead us as we continue to process what we touched on today, and also how to step forward, how to move together in unity for the sake of your kingdom come in us and through us and around us on earth as it is in heaven. As I pray Hebrews 10:23-25, pray that we remember that this does not waver you, this does not surprise you, this does not frighten you. That you give us your Holy Spirit to guide us in that hope of you giving us the task as your church to be about partnering with you as your church. So let us hold tightly without wavering to the hope we affirm, for God can be trusted to keep his promise. Let us think of ways to motivate one another to acts of love and good works. And let us not neglect our meeting together, as some people do, but encourage one another, especially now that the day of his return is drawing near. Jesus, remind us that as we think of all this, we fall to our knees and pray to you, our Father, the creator of everything in heaven and on earth. We pray that from your glorious, unlimited resources, you will empower us with inner strength through your Spirit. Then Christ will make his home in our hearts as we trust in him, so that our roots will grow down into your love and keep us strong. And may we have the power to understand, as all God's people should, how wide, how long, how high, and how deep your love is. May we experience the love of Christ, though it is too great to understand fully. Then we will be made complete with all the fullness of life and power that comes from God. And we plead that all glory goes to you, God, who is able through your mighty power at work within us to accomplish infinitely more than we might ask or think or talk about on a webinar. Glory to you in the church and in Christ Jesus through all generations, forever and ever. Amen.
The USMB Leadership Board is accepting applications for the next National Director of the U.S. Conference of MB Churches. Leadership Board Chair Luke Hadel says the Leadership Board carefully reviewed the results of a 23-question survey emailed to district and ministry leaders and pastors and took the results into consideration as it crafted the job description. Find the job description online at www.usmb.org/national-director-survey-results. Individuals interested in applying for the position are invited to send a resume, personal testimony of faith journey, and a one-page vision statement for their role as National Director to leadership@usmb.org.
Well, again, thanks to Kyle, Wendell, and Joanna for sharing with us on this webinar and on this podcast. And I also just want to thank Don Morris and Janae Rimple and the Christian Leader staff and our USMB leadership. I'm glad that they've noticed this trend and that they want to do something about it. So I think it's good for us to be a little proactive here, since there is this issue that we need to be aware of. So I'm glad our leadership is taking a look at this. And as we mentioned, they're going to dive a little bit deeper in January. Several of our national leaders are gathering to discuss this at a Vision Summit. And so hopefully we can kind of keep you up to date as maybe some new ideas might come from that summit coming up here in January. But now I encourage you, whatever stage of leadership you're in, I encourage you to think about what shoulders can you tap. Choose your words really carefully when you're talking to young leaders. What internships or job opportunities do you have available that you might be able to share with some of these younger Christian leaders? There really is a lot of little things here and there that we can do to chip away at this, so I encourage you to keep those front of mind. Okay, and as I said at the front, this is the last episode of 2023, so thank you so much for those of you who have listened throughout the year. It's hard for me to believe that we're getting close to 100 episodes already. So thank you for your faithful listening, and I look forward to another year of sharing these great stories and great leadership principles with you next year. So I wish you and your family, your church, a very Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, and we'll see you in January.
Thanks for listening to Lead Pods. Make sure you don't miss an episode by subscribing to our show wherever you're listening today. Learn more by visiting usmb.org. And be sure to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. We'll see you next time as we learn more practical tools to increase our impact together.